Well, I hope you guys had a good Thanksgiving, and we got a fun one here today. Raven, this was sent August 23rd, so right as sort of House of the Dragon was beginning to start. And again, we got slammed with emails, so I'm trying to go back and catch up on some of these. Do the Starks have Targaryen ancestors? Is the Night King a Targaryen? It says, I'm a new Game of Thrones fan. I first binged the series on HBO Max last spring, and this summer I read the entire book series. That being said, my evidence is from the TV series and the first episode of Hot D, aka House of the Dragon. I have heard the theories about the Night King being a Stark, and I've come up with a theory of my own. First, do the Starks have Targaryen ancestors? The only piece of evidence I have for this comes from the premiere of House of the Dragon. Rickon Stark pledges his fealty to Princess Rhaenyra with a full head of blonde silver hair. That immediately caught my attention because Jon Snow is half Stark, half Targaryen, but he had dark hair and brown eyes. Is the Night King a Targaryen, not a Stark? Again, my evidence comes from the TV show. The Night King seems very knowledgeable of dragons. He knows how to he knows how to like use them. He can resurrect them, and he's able to fly them. Of course, he may be able to fully control every being that he turns, but I thought that only Targaryens had the ability to touch and fly a dragon on their own. I haven't had the time to sift through the books to look up any other additional evidence. If you guys have any further information, knowledge, or about supporting debunking the theory, I'd love to hear it.
Wow, what a first off, what a well-written Raven. And also awesome to hear that you dove into the books after binging the series. I love hearing that. And we're going to be covering book stuff here. Obviously, we go we're fluid, we kind of go back and forth between the two, obviously focusing a lot on House of the Dragon because it's still very relevant and still fresh in our minds, but always love to hear show watchers diving into the books. And hopefully that's a gateway for you to to continue to relive this series with us here on the podcast. So thanks for sending that in. Matt, what do you make of this Raven?
Point out the character of the Night King, who I find incredibly interesting in both the show and the theory or idea of one existing in the books. And actually, I think you could make an argument that the character in the books, we believe definitely has some Stark ancestry, but then of course could also have some Targaryen lineage. But let's start with the show. So the show, we see a character who becomes the Night King, right?
Yes.
He's there, and the Children of the Forest turn him into one. There's nothing saying that person, we don't really know anything about that person. We see this just human become the big bad villain of Game of Thrones. Like, kind of wild that they never gave us any backstory to that person.
Yeah, I think it's kind of assumed that it's one of the first men. If you look at the Game of Thrones wiki for the television show, it actually says that it's one of the first men, but it's been a while since I've seen the episode wherever they kind of reveal these things. So I'm not positive that it's actually like 100% said that it is one of the first men. But even then, books or show, we know that they talk about the Starks coming from the first men. And, obviously there's wildlings that also reference it. I think it's between Jon and Ygritte. Jon saying, my father was Ned Stark. I have blood of the first men. My ancestors lived here, same as yours. And Ygritte says, so why are you fighting us? So I think it is assumed that it is one of the first men, but would not rule out a possible tie back to the Starks.
I think you could also somehow make an argument, if you really wanted to, that it may not necessarily be a Targaryen, but could be somebody could be Valyrian blood. We do know that the Valyrians flew over here. Dragonstone is a long established before the Doom stronghold for the Targaryens. Theory, possibly, you have to, if you go all the way back to like the first men, well, it doesn't give us an exact date, but we know that there was a bridge of land called the Arm that breaks. Yep. If you really go back and read World of Ice and Fire, it's incredibly vague. And Ezra and I have broke it down so many times. And it's honestly one of the most confusing parts of World of Ice and Fire is the first few chapters, because just the way it sort of tells you everything is happening. You're like, wait, what's going on again? And it's like this huge span of time. It's almost like the only thing I can sort of compare it to that some people might be familiar with is kind of in a way like the Bible, how it's just like the first few books of the Bible is this insane amount of time. And it's like, wait, hold on. How is all of this happening? It's kind of similar. Or even like our own history. It's kind of crazy to think about when you sort of think about like Egypt and all this stuff. And like 3,000 years later, it's like, here we are. It's crazy, really, to sort of
or the Bronze
think.
Age collapse, right? Like
Yeah,
no one really, there's theories about what happened, but like we don't know what happened, and the details are very sparing, and it happened over a long period of time. And it might only take a few pages to kind of get over it, but it's actually a very long
right.
time, and it
It's
feels
crazy.
that's one of the reasons why the World of Ice and Fire book is so phenomenal. I mean,
So
it's
good.
it's so fun to speculate on and dive back into and really think about, how many centuries prior all this stuff
Hmm.
went down in the
Yeah,
Andals and them landing.
thousands of years even.
Crazy. I mean, they landed in the Vale and then they dominated the continent. It's crazy.
Right. Yeah, it's kind of easy to sort of put things in perspective once Aegon comes over,
Mhm.
because just kind of like in our world, right? However, there's, BC and then AD or CE, depending on how you want to, look at it. It's like, wow, it's really easy to sort of view our context in this span of like, 2022 years, right? And then
Yeah.
everything that's BC is like, okay, well, that's like getting kind of old and hard to sort of imagine. So in that book, however, in the World of Ice and Fire book, it does talk about that it just, when it first starts to mention Dragonstone, it mentions that it's just a long time stronghold for the Targaryens. So we have no idea exactly how long they have been in Westeros,
Mhm.
how long they've been flying over here, or other Valyrians. So there is totally nothing to say that that person, the show version of the Night King,
Yes.
could not have Targaryen blood.
Yeah, hard to disprove. How likely is it? So I guess it's up to your imagination, right? Because this is
Right.
probably not something that will ever be answered, I would say, in the show. Like we're never going to get like an episode where they just tell us that.
No.
Maybe subtle clues and breadcrumbs along the way, but I don't think that it'll ever be a definitive answer for it. I think the idea of a Stark having some sort of lineage back to this would make a lot of sense, especially because the First Men, tried to fight off the Andals and like they went north. Like even the region would make sense in this regard if it is a First Men, in fact, that that we saw in the show, and we're speaking strictly of the show here. So I do think it's pretty interesting as far as like Starks and Targaryens and intermingling. I know that there supposedly, as far as we know, have never been two of them. They've never produced a child until Jon Snow. Jon Snow is the first
Right.
child coming up from those two families, and which I think is probably likely. Like that's probably very likely that that was the first child of those two prominent families, and I think that's actually one of the more important pieces of Jon's story. But in the show, who knows?
Right. Yeah. So that's sort of the first part of their question. So they says, do the Starks and Targaryen have do the Starks have Targaryen ancestors? So I would certainly say there's probably down the line. Unfortunately, the Targaryen line is actually the easiest to follow, because
Mhm.
it's like really the only one that exists. A lot of other ones, I mean, heck, we don't even know sometimes who old Nan speaks of a Bran, and we don't even know which brand she's speaking of sometimes, right? So it's sort of hard to piece some of these other families together. But certainly I would say, the Targaryens mostly, I guess, breed, if that's the word you want to use it. Well, one, with themselves, and then two, it's like House Baratheon and House Valerion are the
Mm.
two really sort of most prominent houses that they have significant ties with. So you'd really have to then begin to try to drive down like, okay, well, there's probably some Baratheons along the way that either married Starks or married into another family, but none that immediately just, come up in my mind. In theory, if Robert and Lyanna had been married, because Robert has a lot of Targaryen blood in him, then that could have been a Stark with some good. So there's definitely a lot of speculation as to that. So
Depends on how far you want to go out on the branch, I think. But as far as
yeah,
like prominent Stark and Targaryen, like I don't think that it's ever happened. I don't think it's even alluded to in the show. But again, like a lot of that stuff's murky in the show. And the books I would say I would be pretty confident to say, as far as we know what we have, that that a prominent Targaryen and Stark did not have some sort of relationship until Rhaegar and Lyanna. That is, obviously a pretty pivotal point. But in the show,
Yeah.
they could mess with that if they wanted to, especially now that they're going backwards in time.
Yeah, I think it'd be interesting. I think it would be especially since they didn't necessarily, the show, they could totally change it. And we'll get to I want to talk a little bit about the book idea of the Night King here too, because I think it's just a fun topic because it is totally different.
Mhm.
But yeah, I mean, they could go back and sort of change it to make that person be a Targaryen, which I think would be fun and add some reasoning as to why that person may end up becoming more powerful than what we than how they are, but maybe not just sort of Leaf and the children's magic, sort of turn this thing, as how did they create something that sort of became out of their control,
Yeah.
right? Did it just amplify that person's, say, historical power, right? Could it, what if they had done that to, say, let's just a Greyjoy? Would that person have turned maybe into not like some sort of ice creature like the Starks, and maybe some sort of like water creature, or something? Or if they had done it to a Targaryen, would they had more like fire properties? We don't really know, but it's certainly something kind of cool and interesting to think about.
Oh, definitely. Yeah. I mean, that's pretty wide open for speculation, and there's a lot of fun to be had with those theories.